Hello everyone, my name is Josh and welcome to Whimsical and Interesting Musings. And today I'm going to talk about something a little different from what I've usually been posting: book reviews, TV recommendation videos, talking about films, and I'm going to talk about video games, since the whole entire objective of this channel is to basically, talk about the things that I like and maybe recommend some things that not many people have heard of. I want to talk about a game that might be well known to a lot of you guys. I'm going to be talking about The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Published in 1998 for the Nintendo 64, Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time was the first title to undergo the into 3D transition, because for the longest time, Legend of Zelda pretty much was a 2D platformer that was quite, exclusive to the Sega Mega Drive, the SNES, and various other games consoles. But this was one of the first games to successfully make the transition from 2D side-scrolling to 3D action platformer role-playing game. And this game has quite a special place in my heart because it's a game that I was first introduced to, and Link was one of my first ever role models. I absolutely love Link, and especially the Hero of Time, because he's just such a badass, but also he doesn't have to speak a lot to really convey what he's really feeling, which I absolutely love. And I'm actually kind of really sad that not many people have jumped on that particular train when it comes to adapting the story of The Legend of Zelda. I mean, just having a character who's mostly silent but just reacting off of other characters is an interesting idea, and I wish more filmmakers and TV show runners would actually jump on it. So, yes, I think it's fantastic. So, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time focuses on a land known as Hyrule, and it is basically a large, massive kingdom with all sorts of different species and different, races of people in various different regions. Like, say, for example, creatures that are really hulking and really big and strong and yellow are called the Gorons, and they live up on Death Mountain. And we have the Zoras, which are fish-like creatures who reside in the lower regions of the sea and in a particular place called Zora's Cavern, or Zora's Domain, excuse me. And this particular game lets you explore all those different regions and has you explore all sorts of different elements, such as trying to find a particular item from a particular level, or trying to undergo a certain task that contributes to a bigger whole later on in the story. So the story basically starts off with our hero, the legendary Hero of Time, basically in the middle of sleep, and he has a nightmare about a man pursuing a girl on a horse along with her carer or captor and her carer. And what really is important about this particular scene is it establishes the villain of Ganondorf. It also gives a little hint to the title character of Princess Zelda and her role that will get much bigger as the story goes on. But for now, they're just faces in the crowd, and Link is absolutely terrified. So we cut immediately from that to a discussion that a particular entity known as the Great Deku Tree, who is the head of the forest known as Kokiri Forest, which is mostly the inhabitants of forest children, who have one thing in common in the fact that they all look the same, they all dress in green, and they all have fairy companions. The same cannot be said for the main character of the Hero of Time, Link. He is the only child who doesn't have a fairy companion to guide him through this particular civilization and this particular society. So, the Great Deku Tree tasks Navy, a fairy who basically just has this particular message to give to Link, has to basically serve as his companion throughout the majority of the game. So here begins our first section of the game, which is essentially you've got to get a sword and shield, and you've got to go to the Great Deku Tree and go inside the Great Deku Tree in order to figure out what's bothering him, because he is under the weather, and we have to try to in fact, he's more than a little under the weather, excuse me, he is actually dying. So we have to try to figure out what's actually plaguing him, what parasites are in there, and extinguish them, basically. And this particular level was very intriguing. I liked the fact that you actually go inside the tree and you have to basically fight all these horrible creatures. And it really just set my imagination alight as a child. I absolutely loved this entire sequence. It's a fantastic opener to the series, but also the Kokiri Forest in general basically is a great tutorial for the rest of the game, because if you talk to a lot of the residents, there is actually a lot of advice and very helpful tidbits that they give you to actually help you work around the fact that you have a fairy. Let's say, for example, if you want to communicate with someone, you just press the R button on or the lock-on system on your controller, and you can actually talk to a character who is several feet above you. And I actually really like that touch, and I also like the fact that all the characters have something to say, and most of the characters, besides one who's actually guarding the entrance to the Great Deku Tree, are actually very happy that Link finally has a fairy companion, and I absolutely just love the relationship between him and a girl called Saria, who is essentially his friend, but there could be little hints that there would have been something a little deeper if they actually, talk to each other a little bit more, but they actually did, spend a lot of time together, and it's very heartbreaking when, spoiler alert, Link actually decides to leave Kokiri Forest to go out on his great destiny to eventually save the land of Hyrule. But what's very interesting about this particular first boss is the setup, because the initial setup is you're meant to basically help the Great Deku Tree get over this particular horrible thing that's going on with him. But what happens afterwards is the Great Deku Tree simply tells you that there's much bigger fish to fry here. This isn't your first and only outing in Link. You've got to actually go and visit all these great places and get these special items so that you have a much greater destiny early on, much later on. I think that's really fantastic, and it really adds a certain level of actual, excuse me, an actual level of the main character, sort of like a cause and effect thing, where when you do one thing, it actually leads into a much more bigger story much later down the line. But what's really great about this entire opening sequence is it manages to also really intrigue you as to what's going on in the plot, but it also manages to make you cry, as we see a major death happen in this particular sequence. And it's actually really tragic to see the Great Deku Tree go from this very vibrant and colour of brown to an absolute, really dark, almost corruptible shade of black as he basically fades from the world. And that was particularly heartbreaking because that was a great visual representation of death. So if you're a child and you don't know particularly what's going on with the Great Deku Tree, the game designers actually do a very good job of actually communicating that to the viewer without actually spelling it out. And they do actually have dialogue that hints that his time isn't particularly long-winded anymore. It's now cut, quite short. Or the game actually does a very good job of really just keeping that in check, so that when you do actually have that moment, you can actually have the audience pause and actually let it sink in. And I love the fact that after the Great Deku Tree dies, there is no music. There is absolutely no music to speak of, and it's such a great moment because it really shows that the gamers actually really are planning on taking you on a journey, and this isn't just simply a fun, light-hearted romp with a child protagonist being a warrior and kicking ass. It's basically about a boy who is very alone, going from being very alone and very isolated in the land that he grew up in, to having a ton of adventures, but there's also a layer of tragedy to the entire proceedings, because the Hero of Time doesn't really do the job that he was supposed to do, and that's the thing that I really kind of find is quite refreshing about this particular game, is that it doesn't have a very stereotypical hero's journey structure. Yes, there is a hero achieving a certain destiny, but when we get to halfway through the game, which is when a particular plot twist happens, or a particular change in the dynamic happens, that's when the game really starts to demand your attention and really take up a lot of your intrigue and curiosity. And it's a fantastic way of keeping the game relatively, fresh as you're going along. And a lot of the time I do think that's fantastic and it's really well done here, and it's just such a great way of introducing the game and tying everything together. But where this game really shines is both the world design and the way these characters basically interact with each other. All these characters have specific ways of giving you advice, and if you do a task for them, they'll often give you things that are of great importance. Like, say, for example, if you go to a local village and you help a woman rescue her chickens, she will give you an empty bottle, which is actually quite useful if you want to have, say, for example, catch a fish in a bottle, or if you want to have a particular flask of red potion, and which is basically something that will help you to regain your health. You can get those things with one empty bottle, and of course, with every single task that you do, you will get an empty bottle. So you won't always get an empty bottle, but you will get, you know, a special item that it does actually provide a lot of interesting insight into either the world, the characters, or will actually help you in your quest. Next, I actually really have a lot of things to talk about. First of all, my favourite section isn't just the Great Deku Tree, and the reason why I chose the Great Deku Tree as one of my favourite levels overall is the boss. The boss in the Great Deku Tree is a horrible creature known as Queen Gomer, and she was an absolute nightmare for me as a kid. I absolutely love Queen Gomer and how terrifying she can and intimidating she can be, but she's also kind of a bit of a pushover when you realise what you can actually do to beat her very quickly. And I thought that was very fun for me, because whenever I play it now as an adult, I actually find myself thinking, yeah, this boss is actually really easy. But when I was a child, I was actually really intimidated. I mean, just that scene where you're told to basically go to first person camera and then look up at the ceiling, and she's just there staring at you with her one eye. That's actually quite scary as a child, and I wouldn't be surprised if people have told me, you know, yeah, that used to scare you as a kid a lot, didn't it? But yeah, Queen Gomer is quite a terrifying boss, but when you actually play that particular boss as an adult and you beat her, it's actually really interesting and very easy. So, yeah, she's my favourite, but I do actually think there is a much better boss who I think really does, as you know, absolutely, you know, take the biscuit in my opinion, and that is the boss of Phantom Gannon. I think the concept of Phantom Gannon is such a fascinating idea, and the way that boss is basically laid out, it's simply put, you have to basically fight a doppelganger version of Ganondorf, the main villain, and he essentially is using paintings and going into paintings and coming out of paintings to try to pull the wool over your eyes. And it's a great magician's trick. It's like the mirror, it's like the Hall of Mirrors in a fun house. It really just kind of has this feeling of absolute suspense and terror and dread, and I just really, really love it. But the boss is actually really tricky and very difficult, but that comes a little bit later in the game, and it actually is a great starting off point for fans of for wannabe fans of The Legend of Zelda, because it actually tells you its structure very early on, which is where I kind of try to tie back earlier with the concept of when you start off fighting the Great Deku in the Great Deku Tree, doing that dungeon. It starts off that you're kind of trying to do this task for the Great Deku Tree, where you're trying to get to the bottom of what's making him so ill and what's causing him to literally lose his will to live. And then he opens up and says, you know, you've got a much bigger job to do. There's this guy from the desert who is actually trying to claim leadership and rulership and dominion over the whole entirety of Hyrule and usurp the king of Hyrule, and, you know, try to, you know, get rid of Princess Zelda and all the rest of it. And that's just the starting point of how complicated this particular story gets. Because as the story goes on, when you do the Great Deku Tree, you have to go to Death Mountain and get a particular spiritual stone called the Spiritual Stone of Fire. And that's in the Death Mountain, at the very height of Death Mountain, in a place called Dodongo's Cavern. And when you've defeated the boss, which is Dodongo, by, you know, challenging him to a fight, you get the second spiritual stone called the Spiritual Stone of Fire, and you get the third spiritual stone in Zora's domain, hence why I referenced them earlier. and you have to basically get it by going to rescue the princess, and she is a pain in the arse. And I'm not just saying that because escort missions are usually really bad, traditionally bad if you're a gamer, but honestly, a Zora's daughter, Princess Ruto, I think her name is. Yeah, she is an absolute pain, and she's meant to be a pain. She's meant to be really difficult and really stubborn and really selfish. But that all comes to a head when we actually beat the boss, we beat Dodongo's Cavern, and she gives us the third spiritual stone, and she wants to marry Link, and it's actually really funny, that entire exchange where she tries to flirt with him and he's just very nervous and uncomfortable. I love that scene. Yeah, but it's actually really funny, but it's also really sweet as well. But what's really great about this particular section is that every character that you come into contact with has a much larger role to play later on. So all these things that you're doing for them now will actually have massive repercussions later on in the story when we get to the main meat of this particular game, which is when you return to the castle of Hyrule and you are about to meet Princess Zelda. The gate opens and it starts to go dark and stormy, and then you're thinking, what the hell is going on here? But then, oh no, deja vu, Legend of Zelda, Princess Zelda's riding out of Hyrule Castle with her bodyguard trying to escape, and she's being pursued by Ganondorf, the guy from the desert who's planning on usurping the Hyrule throne and trying to take over Hyrule. And at first, he is totally, cool and collected, like he's going, damn, lost them. Oh boy, where did you see that princess and a horse and carriage riding about? Like, where are they? Answer me. Like, he's very cool and collected to begin with, but then he starts to get very intimidating, and then he begins to get, I say things like, "Oh, you think you can protect them from me, can't you?" And I just love it, and I love the voice actor who voices Ganon, even though he doesn't voice Ganon, but he provides the laugh, and he provides the little vocal tricks, like when he goes "ha," "yeah," and things like that, and what have you. It's actually really funny, but he's a great voice actor, and I really do like the fact that even though he was just told to just do sound effects, he still managed to create quite a character with this particular choice of vocal performance, and it was just fantastic. So yeah, we go back to the Hyrule Castle and we pull the Master Sword once we place the spiritual stones in their proper crest, and we get the Master Sword and we essentially pull it from the stone, like the sword in the stone, and 7 years have passed, and the hero of time, Link, has grown up. So now he has to do a very special job of getting all the spiritual guardians of forest, mountain, sea, desert, and fire all the way back into their proper place as sages of these guardians of the sacred realm. And yeah, there's quite a bit of twists and turns here and there, but the idea alone that Link has not been present and the world has pretty much gone to pot in his absence for all those 7 years is actually quite a mind-boggling thing, because essentially Link's failed in his initial mission to save Hyrule, and it really does leave an impact on you. So yeah, it's pretty damn impressive. I love how everything that you go through in the first half of the game as a child pays off in some way later on in the game. It's just such a fantastic way of tying everything together and making you feel like you're really going through the gambit of what everything is connecting to, and various different twists and turns. And honestly, I was not expecting some of the twists that actually happened in this game when I was a kid. But I absolutely loved it. I think it's one of my favourite games of all time, and I really do appreciate the game from a storytelling standpoint and from a gameplay standpoint, and what the designers and what the writers of this game were able to do to really tie everything together quite nicely. It's really fantastic, and I absolutely love it. It's a fantastic game. And I would honestly recommend it as a great starting off point for any Legend of Zelda fans. It's such a great reminder of its structure, where it starts off one way, and then halfway through, or or at the middle point of the game, it starts to get even more complicated, and there's more storytelling elements and ideas at play as we go further along. So I'm giving The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 5 stars out of 5. It's such a fantastic game, and I would highly recommend it if you are a sort of like a if you want to become a fan and start off with The Legend of Zelda. I'd recommend this game in a heartbeat. It's fantastic. I love it. So I hope you guys enjoy, and this has been Josh with Whimsical and Interesting Musings. Have a great day. Goodbye.